Welcome on behalf of the Center for Crisis Studies and Mitigation at the University of Manchester. My name is Ponsu Vanasing. I'm a research associate at the center and an organizer of the series. The purpose of our center is to bring together different researchers across the university working on natural hazards and their impacts on society. I want to thank Professor David Schultz, the principal investigator and head of our center, for supporting the series. As you can see on the screen, we have a great selection of speakers coming up in the next few weeks and well into the autumn. The format of today's talk will be as follows. During the seminar, you can enter questions into the chat box. If you prefer to keep it private, you can send them directly to me, the moderator. We'll do our best to get through all the questions within the top of the hour. So today, on the International Day for Women in Engineering, please allow me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rwayda Al-Hamed. Dr. Al-Hamed has a PhD in civil engineering from the University of Manchester. She is a research associate in the Department of Mechanical, Aerospace, and Civil Engineering. And she's currently conducting research on comparative stakeholder engagement processes with regards to the assessment of flood risk management in Thailand. And she's also due to begin a lectureship in further pastures beyond Manchester in the autumn. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome Dr. Rwayda Al-Hamed.
Great. Thank you, Bon, for the nice introduction. I'm glad to be here today and talking to you. First, like Bon said, my name is Rwayda Al-Hamed. I'm a research associate at the University of Manchester at the Maize department. My research focus is on Thai. We're conducting a stakeholder engagement study investigating the infrastructure in Thailand. First, I would kick my presentation off saying happy day for all women engineers all across the globe. And it was a coincidence, and I'm presenting on the International Women in Engineering Day. I hope all the women engineers and everyone else has a great day today, and would like to thank you for joining in. So first, for those who don't know what's a disaster resilient infrastructure, I will kick off on a simple definition. So a disaster, if you look it up in the dictionary, it will be a sudden accident that you weren't expected, that causes damage to the whatever it is, building or whatever. Resilience has by definition is how strong you are to recover from an impact of a disaster or an accident. So, and the infrastructures are, for those who are not familiar with the term infrastructure, is the basic physical buildings and organization and structure in a city, drainage system, dams, electric power supply. So these are all infrastructure. So when I'm saying disaster resilient infrastructure, I mean we want to build an infrastructure that strong and resilient to the sudden disasters. So I promised you in my abstract 2 floods. I'll kick off talking about the Great Flood. I would say, like, from the very first royal civilization, floods were a risk to humanity. So I'm originally from Iraq, and what you're seeing in the background is the Great Zagharat of Ur. And I will kick off on a very ancient story on flood. So the Great Flood. So one of the first records we have on floods is the Gilgamesh flood myth. And who Gilgamesh is he's one of the semi-mythical kings of Uruk in Mesopotamia. So he was a very strong, powerful king, and there is this whole epic of Gilgamesh record of tablets talking about his incredible journey to seeking mortality. I want to say, like, in the start of his journey, he was a bit cruel and he was unfair to people. And through his journey, at the end, he managed to find the herb that could give him mortality, and the herb was stolen by a snake. But he found out mortality could be achieved by being good to people and by constructing and being a fair ruler. So that's like the whole epic thing. But in his journey, he managed to meet Utanabishtim. And Utanabishtim is the guy who told him about the flood story. And Utanabishtim was the survivor. So the story in the tablets goes like this. There was like the gods in ancient Mesopotamia decided the human were too noisy, and they wanted to shut them off. So they decided to flood the whole earth, which is for them was Mesopotamia. So they wanted to flood the whole earth and get rid of the humans because they were annoying. So, and here's come the god, one of the god, Ea. He decided, he's a god of water, he decided to go and tell Utanabishtim, who was a good guy, he was a good human. He told him that God decided to flood the earth. So you need to build an ark, gather the animals, gather humans, I want you to survive. And he did that, and he lived to tell about it. This is one record showing that floods were like been a threat to humanity since a very young age. And well, this is the tablet record are coming from the Akkadian period, which is around to 2300 to 2100 before Christ. But it's like it's shown in the records like these. The Epic of Gilgamesh is even older than that, so it's 1,500 years older. So that would bring us to the very early Sumer, so the very first civilization. You see on the right hand side of the screen now is what they think who's Gilgamesh, and he has a lion on his hand to present his power. It seems like Mesopotamia had lions at the time. We don't have any lions anymore. Anyway, so I wanted to say from the Gilgamesh flood myth, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have a record on floods, on the very first floods recorded, or they think what that is. And there's similar like kind of stories in the Bible and in Quran about Noah. We all know the story of Noah, or as we say in Arabic, Nuh. He also talked about the flood that was a risk to humanity. Anyway, so seems like floods being a risk to humanity since the start of civilization. Now I'll talk about modern day Iraq and climate change. So if we think of modern day Iraq, you would expect that the climate change would bring us droughts, but the data shows we would even get even more floods in our in Iraq. So this is the data fact sheet from the USAID organization in 2017 is basically presenting that there will be an increase in the average temperature. We will get more extreme weather because we're getting more intense precipitation of rain, would lead to more floods and drought. Also, it shows like it will have a huge impact on the energy and infrastructure. Would cause a reduction in our electricity generation, and also it will be huge damage to the infrastructures. So to summarize, what will happen in climate-wise in Iraq will be decrease in the amount of rain, the total amount of rain. However, it will be an increase in the rainfall intensity. So we'll get more intense rain, and the infrastructure, the drainage infrastructure won't be able to sustain it. We will got flash floods from the torrential rain, and also from the rivers. Also, I just said so. We will get increased river expected to intensity in floods. Also, the other thing, this will lead to more aggressive damage to our infrastructures. So examples, so we can see in 2015 there was a huge flood, flash flood, and this is another example from November 2018 where we got a flash flood, huge flash flood in Wasat, and very recently, last March, we got the torrential rain to give us a flash flood in Diyala. Sadly, quite a lot of people are dying in these floods. We don't have enough flood defenses. We need to plan more risk action plan, emergency action plan to get the people out, and we need to also think ahead about what's wrong and why we keep getting these flash floods. So in Iraq, the problem is not only the climate change, because in Iraq you will add conflict to the problem. So we don't have only climate change which everyone is having. We have an unstable situation which would have been going for a while. So if I go through the timeline for the Iraqi conflict, so in the 1980s, we got Iraq-Iran war, Gulf War, 1990. Then we got in 2003, the Saddam Hussein outsider. Then we got the new government, elections. Then 2006 was really bad period of a sectarian violence, and we almost touched the civil war bit in there. Then in 2011, the US troops pulled out, causing more violence in between the political parties. And I think we might all know that in between 2014 and 2018, quite a bit of the Iraqi areas were occupied by ISIS, and that caused a lot of problem to everything. And very recently, in 2019, we got a protest from the people in Iraq, because people there are unemployed, underemployed, and there's a huge corruption happening in there. So people were protesting for the basic life needs. They just wanted electricity, they just wanted a secure job, and water, drainage system, protection. So they just were protesting again for their basic needs to live everyday life, which leading us to 2020, which is the worldwide pandemic. Sadly, in Iraq, up to the day, we have around 1,100 people sadly passed away due to the COVID. And our infrastructure, our health infrastructure are not ready. So that would leave us eventually with 40 years of conflict. So what did this conflict caused in terms of the result in the situation in Iraq, and we're talking about mainly here infrastructures. We have the lack of planning for resilience of infrastructure. So the infrastructure we already had were planned in between the 70s and 80s. The climate is changing. We have the impact of the conflict. We have destruction of these infrastructure. The poor maintenance of the existing ones is all happening. So these things need to be changed. Now I'll move on to talk about a very sad story about Mosul. We all may know that in around 2014, 2018, that ISIS occupied cities in Iraq, and one of them is Mosul. And in this sad photo, you would see what happened to Mosul after ISIS were vanished, and we managed to get the city back, but the city was destroyed. So in order to restore the city of Mosul, Iraq government and the World Bank have this plan to start preparing detailed design for reconstruction of the facility of the city, because as you've seen in the picture, everything there is destroyed. Also, we need to get more equipment for providing and sustaining water. And the other proposed solution was the involvement of the private sector in the construction. And finally, which is links to what I'm saying today, we need to establish a water security plan for both the water we're drinking, and also we need to take into the consideration the impact of the climate change and flooding. That basically the plans for today's Mosul, but we seems to have a more challenge on the horizon at the moment with the situation, with the Iraqi situation, and that is a risk of a major flood. And this risk have been going for a while now. It's a possible failure of Mosul Dam. Mosul Dam is located just outside the city of Mosul. I'll show where the location in a bit. So I'll give you a bit of background to the dam. So the dam was constructed in January 1981, the start of the construction of the dam. And that, if you remember the timeline for the conflict I was talking about, was like in the middle of the Iraqi-Iran war. So if you imagine like we're building a dam during the war, so that would lead to some mistakes. So during the construction, the engineers in the site found a significant flaw in the dam design, and this basically it's poor foundation. Mosul Dam was based on a gypsum soil, and this was like a threat of a collapse of the dam even during the construction. The government at the time decided to consult with a Swiss consultancy, and the Swiss consultancy study showed that a disaster, well, I'm quoting what they're saying, a disaster which could occur if a dam maintenance and protection were carelessly neglected. So if we keep that in mind, up to today, the governmental effort are kept on going in there to sustain the dam. There were an emergency action plan was developed to protect the dam. Regular maintenance are still in place to protect the dam. So up to the date of this webinar, The dam is under regular review and supervision from the Iraqi Ministry of Water Resources. We have quite a lot of people involved with that. We have an Italian consultancy that works on the dam. There is a local committees that does supervise the dam and the situation and the maintenance process. But it seems like we are spending way too much money on maintaining the dam in the first place, and we're having so much risk in the current complex situation. So the dam is happily and luckily is under control at the moment. But what if during ISIS occupation of Mosul, what if ISIS managed to get to the dam? The conflict would have been affect the regular maintenance of the dam. And what that would be that be a disaster by choice? If you like, I'm not sure if anyone attended the very first webinar held by the center. It was basically by Dr. Ian Culliman. He has a recently issued book about disaster by choice. And I think in the case of the careless neglection of the Mosul Dam, that would be definitely a disaster by choice. And what will happen, and there's like a few studies on what would happen on that. Mosul Dam, as you can see here, is located just outside the city of Mosul. And it's a huge dam, and the possible outcome of its failure will affect the whole country. So first, we will get a huge flood wave with about 20-meter size height that will impact the whole city of Mosul. And if you think of the city of Mosul today, it's still under construction. It still need to be to develop more. And if that happens, that the flood will destroy the whole city and would kill quite a lot of people. This flood will continue downstream. I'll show you some pictures of that in a bit. So that the flood will continue downstream, heading to Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, and will affect, in its way, it will affect several million people. And when it reached the flood wave, when it reached Baghdad, around 7.5 million people will be affected one way or another. So that would be so many businesses, so many lives, and so many losses on economics. That would be a huge effect on the country, which is burdened by corruption at the moment. So to see, if you have a look on the flood map, for the flood map expected for Mosul, you can see that is the dam will collapse. It will affect the whole city of Mosul. Then it will continue downstream until it got to Baghdad. Baghdad is partly affected, but Baghdad is a very dense city with quite a lot of poor neighborhoods. So that would have a huge impact on people. So Iraq, what would need to happen next? First, replan and think ahead. So we need to take the climate change situation more seriously, and we need to replan the infrastructures in the country and think ahead on developing more disaster resilient infrastructure. So Iraq needs to replan and think ahead in terms of investing in more disaster and more resilient infrastructure that would protect the country. So that's the first bit. That was the first bit of my talk. Now I'll move on to the second bit. So before I would start my second bit, I would just want to say that what I said on the Iraqi situation is based on my background as I was in Iraq for a year and a half after I finished my PhD. I worked at the Ministry of Higher Education in there. My current project focuses on Thailand and the scoping the current situation of the infrastructures in Thailand. So Thailand and climate change. So what will happen to Thailand climate-wise? Again, more droughts are expected, decreased in agricultural and fishery yards yields. Also, violent flooding are expected, a rise in the sea level, and finally increased wind will and intensity, which will impact the whole city. And that is basically the typhoons hitting the city all over the whole country. Sorry, the typhoons hitting the country all over again. I promised 2 floods. I talked about the great floods, the mythical one that happened in it's a mythical, so it did not happen, sorry. So the mythical flood from Gilgamesh epic. So the second great flood is sadly a real one. In 2011, Bangkok and quite a lot of the provinces in Thailand were heavily impacted by a flood. They call it the Great Flood of 2011. So a bit of background on the climate and the situation on climate of Thailand. So Thailand generally have a tropical climate and with monsoon rains every summer. So what happened in 2011 and led to the disaster? There were like unusually heavy rain accumulated with a sequence of typhoons. So this combination resulted in a huge, massive flood. From here you can see the flood map for what happened in Thailand in 2011. And from that, the impact was huge on both tragic human losses. So sadly, around 608,000 lives were lost in the flood. Around 13 million people were affected by the flood. And the total damage and impact on economy was around $46.5 billion US. And the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the city was like the estimated cost was to be $48 billion US. So quite huge amount of money. And again, the flood affected the infrastructure, it's affected the drainage, electricity, transport, telecommunication, and water sanitation. I'll go through a few examples. I'll start by saying the electricity in Thailand for the transmission line would look like that. And this is would be a bit tragic during a flood. So you can imagine what the flood would what the electricity transmission lines would look like after the flood. And the transport, so you can see one of the main airport in Bangkok was under flood, was closed for a couple of months after that for maintenance. And you can see the transport road, it affected the power supply, it affected the the transmission of people. It's had a huge impact on the whole economy and transportation. Thailand today. So what's Thailand doing today? Thailand is moving toward disaster resilient infrastructures. And they have learned a lesson from the 2011 flood, and there was like a huge one in 2004 as well, and so many like before that. So the government learned the lesson. So while they're investing more now in strengthening flood management, understanding the nature of the disaster risk, establishing an effective early warning system, and most importantly, investing in more resilient infrastructure. So Thailand are building their infrastructure or rebuilding infrastructure after 2011 flood to be built back better, safer and stronger. So basically they're adopting the choice of using disaster resilient infrastructures. So my final remark from this talk is there should be more investment to be done on disaster resilient infrastructure, because that is becoming more crucial, especially in developing countries. And I want to quickly say something else, is basically it's not only the developing country, even the developed ones, like last week, the UK around Manchester area where I'm based at the moment got a flood, flash floods from the torrential rain. So more effort should be invested in building more disaster resilient infrastructures. Finally, thank you for listening. And any question are welcome.
All right, so we're open to questions if any of our participants want to send in any to myself as the moderator. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I wondered, as maybe perhaps as a first question, given the comparison between a post-conflict situation in Iraq and Thailand, which is not in a, I actually am Thai, but Thailand hasn't undergone, the same kinds of conflict that would affect the kinds of ruling coalitions that you need to keep bureaucracies and infrastructure maintenance going. So on that front, if we're thinking about infrastructure maintenance today under the context of Thailand, which has a ruling party and somewhat fragmented power, and Iraq, where do you see that comparison working today?
Well, yeah, as you could see from my presentation, Thailand is in much more stronger situation than Iraq at the moment. So Thailand has plans to develop disaster resilience infrastructures and to protect and to invest more in the infrastructures and flood defenses as well. And one of the documents I've been reading was like Bangkok is trying to get into the 100 climate resilient cities. So in Thailand, the situation is much better. Like the government is taking much more like actions, let's say, towards moving forward. In Iraq, the situation is still under conflict. So the corruption in the country and the lack of planning is keep on going. So I just the government still tries to sustain a form of development in infrastructure. I think what should happen is like Iraq should learn from Thai experience, let's say.
What would be some of the best practices? You think that might be transferable from the Thai context to the Iraqi context, and also just as somebody who's not familiar with the Iraqi topography, as my birthday is usually in September, and in Bangkok, September is prime flood season. So everybody drives an SUV or tries to sort of stay above 2 feet, the 2 feet mark. So what are the we have monsoon seasons in Thailand, but what is the rainfall like in Iraq in terms of
so like the floods would occur in between October and March. So like you'll get the intense rainfall in Iraq in between October and March. So I think it's mainly two things to get from the Thai experience with the floods. So the first one is the social readiness. As you say, everyone knows it's as a flood season, so people socially are prepared for a flood. So that's the first aspect that I think that Iraq need to adopt from Thailand. So we need to be ready that in between October and March, we would like kind of get few floods in the area around flash floods around the rivers. So that's the first aspect you would learn. And the second aspect, in my opinion, is how Thailand after the flood started building back better. That the term they're using, building back better the infrastructures. So the Iraqi infrastructures in quite a lot of city are destroyed. So if we have a plan on reconstructing them in a better way, so it's not just reconstruction, so it's reconstruction to be stronger and safer. That would be the other thing that I think Iraq should adopt from the Thai experience.
We have a question in from Dave Schultz. In the Iraq flooding example, how much of this development was funded internationally versus internally?
I think it was like, I would say 70% from internal and 30% from external sources. So quite a lot of the organization like the USAID and stuff, they're funding reconstruction in Iraq. I don't have like the correct percentage, but that's basically roughly from my experience, because like the government keep on saying we have plans to reconstruct.
Dave says, thank you. What does flood, in terms of this line of reasoning around building back better, in the Iraq context or in the Thai context, what would flood resilient infrastructure look like? I mean, what would be a recommendation?
Well, it would be like the same, but you might use more stronger material, more sustainable material. You might invest more in, like Thai is investing more in building the impact wall for the waves. I think you'll be more familiar with that than me. So they're building this wall that would sustain the impact of waves from the sea. So that's the thing, and also like developing the area around the river protection, like impact wall, retaining wall and stuff. So just like more investment in these should be done.
All right, we have two further questions from Richard. Thanks for an interesting talk. Since the potential Mosul flood disaster might affect the neighbors, is there any joint work or at least communication between neighbors to prevent and prepare for the flood?
Well, I'm not like very informative on that. I would assume kind of there's some communication, but I think Iraq is a bit it's not in good agreement with the neighbors at the moment.
We got a question from Lee. What work is being done to protect Iraq's ancient sites from climate change?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Basically, the government keep on putting money to protect the ancient sites. There is quite few simple procedures at like now that I'm aware of that they're trying to protect the ancient cities, but there is not a major things done. There's quite a lot of global universities are investing in the sites. There's like a group from Manchester, there's a group from Italy, and there's a group from Germany, I'm assuming. So they're trying to do stuff, but I don't think it's sufficient to protect the ancient sites. Especially like we have, I'm not sure if you're aware of that, we have Babylon based like really near the river, the ancient ruins of Babylon, and it's hugely impacted by flood, and might also would be impacted by groundwater.
So as a civil engineer, I mean, in the example of Babylon, for example, is that, I have no engineering background, so is that an example in which not only are flood walls insufficient, but, you know, what would be the groundwater implications in terms of, you know, resilient infrastructure?
Well, groundwater would have, let's say, salty nature in some cases. So I think it could like you could use the groundwater on improving the agricultural aspect. So you can use it to water your planets rather than keep it down there affecting the infrastructure. So there are quite a lot of sustainable solutions, and you can use the groundwater for drinking sometimes if it have the right salt contain and watering the ground as well. So you just need to be careful with that. So I think more investment is needed in groundwater as well in this area.
That comes from our next question from a participant is, how is infrastructure being developed to manage both drought and flood?
Sorry, can you?
The question is, how is infrastructure being developed to manage both drought and flood?
Both.
How is infrastructure being developed to manage both drought and flood?
Okay. Well, there is not much done at the moment in the Iraqi scenario. We're still putting the basis for the plans. For example, the Ministry of Water Resources have a committee that is mainly to set new emergency action plan, development plan for the infrastructures, but the plans the country has is always conflicted with the conflicts, external conflicts. So like you've seen, like it's every 5 years there's something external comes to the country. So they still keep on putting on the plans, but they're not implementing the plans on real life, if that makes sense.
We have a participant who would like to offer some commentary from the Bangladesh experience, if you are open to.
That would be great.
Okay, so I will. We have Mr. Arif Ahmed, who will comment on the Bangladeshi flood response. Mr. Arif?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, I'm Arif Ahmed. I'm from Bangladesh. Now I'm talking from Dhaka, capital of Bangladesh. And thank you, Rwayda Al-Hamid, for your nice presentation.
Thank you.
It's very informative for me, because actually I have a little knowledge on the climate change and the situation on Iraq and Thailand. Actually, you may know Bangladesh is very disaster-prone country, and there is a different types of natural hazard frequently occur in our country. So flood is one of them. So sometimes it's due to a heavy rain, or sometimes it's due to another tropical cyclone. So we are facing in we are facing very difficulties actually, and sometimes people are died due to the flood, and due to the flood we have lots of agricultural field that are damaged, and we always count the economic loss. Actually our farmers are very poor. So actually the situation is completely different in Dhaka city, because here if rain is more than some level, then the canals of the Dhaka city are jammed, and roads are drowning. Even the first floor or ground floor of many of the buildings, apartments are drowned. So actually, Bangladesh are facing lots of difficulties. It's like, so thank you. Actually, I'm a student of statistics background, but I have completed another master's in environmental science, and now I'm working with natural hazard, natural disasters, and the agricultural production and agricultural practices. So
Well, thank
I
you for
have
dialing in all the way from Dhaka, Mr. Ahmed. We appreciate your feedback today from Bangladesh in the context of these other cases.
sorry.
All right. Okay, we have, I think before we wrap up for today, there seem to be three separate areas, right? There are questions about, financing around infrastructure and whether administrations have the political will and financial ability to carry out resilient builds. I think then there are questions around engineering questions around design as well, and what is appropriate and what is happening in various contexts. So if we think about Bangladesh versus Iraq or Thailand, to my knowledge, I think Bangladesh has islands that are receding. It's surrounded by ocean as opposed to inland parts of Iraq. So that I think there's an issue of political agency, will, and financing, design aspects, and then the climate sort of extreme weather aspects of different kinds of rainfall. I wonder, from a civil engineer's perspective, what might be some of the key takeaways you want our audience to leave with today when thinking about comparative flood response?
Well, first will be because you would spend money on building more resilient infrastructures. So you don't want to go and spend around your money on everything. So there's should be a study to investigate which infrastructures are more important to invest in. That would be the economical bet. You would need, as an engineer, you would need the input of the climate change. So I would say in between, you summarize it well with the 3 bullet points. So you need the money aspect, you need the input from the changing in climate change studies, and you need an engineer that knows which infrastructures are affected more and which one is more important to invest in. So for example, you might think it's more important to invest in retaining wall, or is investing in the transmission line for electricity Thailand case. So you need to conduct a study investigating which is the most important thing you want to invest in. Then you start putting money into that, because you don't want to go and build everything resilience, because that's not what civil engineering is all about. Because we can build things as strong as we can, but it would be costly.
There are also, I mean, these are political questions. So, I mean, in Thailand, Bangkok is sinking. I mean, there's as a city, it is sinking, and those who have the financial means have moved to the northern, you know, Chiang Mai, northeast agricultural areas. You know, informal workers who are stuck in urban areas are literally sinking with the city. So I think when in the Thai context, when people talk about flood resilience, there are political questions about where the sandbags go usually, and where the infrastructure goes, right? You know, do you spend the money on protecting electricity, you know, areas for special economic zones, or, you know, other areas where, you know, informal workers are loading docks, the loading docks where they, you know, receive rice from the northern areas. So these engineering questions are very tied up with political issues, I imagine.
Yes. I think everything is compiled into one huge node.
For the Iraq case, though, I mean, what is the most recent flood? Are the Iraqi floods are they, you know, are they amplified or increasing in their intensity, or is it the combination of regular storms but also infrastructure that is degrading?
Exactly. You just answered yourself in there. So you'll have you have your infrastructures. So let's say like the drainage infrastructure in Iraq. So the drain of your water was designed in the 70s. So it's been like 40 years since it's designed. The climate changed, and also there quite a lot of like increase on population. So we have more people now in Iraq, and we have the conflict that either destroyed or let's say held back the construction of the new ones. So you have all three factors on the same acting on the same line to produce a flood. So you'll have more intense rain. We have less rain than before, but it's like the intensity of the rain is higher. So even if the infrastructure were not impacted by the conflict, they still were not designed to hold as much rain as we got, and that's what was causing the flood. So it's a combination in between degrading infrastructures and climate change issue, and then you'll add on the top of that the conflict that is stopping any replanning from happening.
No, it's interesting. I not to hijack this conversation, but you know, my background is in looking at dams in the Mekong region, and even at the height of the Vietnam War, which was proxy, you know, fought in Laos. Interestingly, you know, royalist, communist, all the different parties that were involved in the Indo-Chinese conflict and on the ground in Laos, the one truce that all of the different actors of that conflict could agree on was that the U.S. Army Corps would continue to build the dams and the ravines that were necessary for carrying out engineering plans. And so, you know, it would be interesting to kind of revisit that in the context of, you know, 21st century conflict and infrastructure. You know, whether there are on the international law side, there are agreements around not impacting ongoing projects, but whether that's the case with, you know, ISIS or
Yeah, I don't think that was the case with ISIS, because what ISIS was kind of doing, they were kind of stopping the water going down, running down to Baghdad, and it was like one of their methods. And they also attacked the oil lines. You know, like in Iraq is a huge, full of oil country, and we got the oil lines going all the way from the north to export and stuff. So what ISIS did is they blow up the lines, or they just cut it off because they control the whole chunk of area in between Syria and Mosul. And there's quite a lot of the oil lines going in there. So they just invaded the lines, and they could steal the oil and sell it themselves. And that impacted the price of oil by quite much, because they were selling oil in black market with a very cheap price. So I don't think like this kind of agreement, like laws and governmental, like external, international agreement would work in a situation like ISIS situation, for example.
We do have an interesting, one of our participants, Ida Majton, did forward this FAO report with the Aquastat data on international agreements related to the Tigris and the Mosul dams. And I think our last question comes from Richard, who wonders whether the potential for flood disaster from the dams is in addition to issues of irrigation and other water problems. I mean, if you had to sort of look at it in terms of the Iraqi context, your talk was mostly about dam degradation. But then there's issues of drought and things like that. So is the dam degradation in terms of priorities, irrigation? There was some talk about Babylon and groundwater issues. If you were to contextualize the key flood resilient action plans, perhaps in Iraq.
Well, I basically would invest more, because like we have in Iraq, we have a huge power supply electricity problem that affects the whole country. So I think if we invest more in getting the Mosul Dam more resilient, because it's one of the dams that generate electricity. So if we can get it to sufficiently work, be more resilient, rather than keep on having it as expenditure, so we keep on spending money on maintaining it. So if we invest a bit more than the regular maintenance for it, and get it to work back as electricity, so we'll provide electricity to the country, because we're importing electricity from Turkey and from Iran. And if we get it to work, we will get more electricity. And if we invest a bit more on the historical sites, because if you lose them, there's no replacement for those. So I think the main two key issues to invest in Iraq is, first is the recreation, let's say, of Mosul Dam to be more resilient, and the protection of historical sites, because if you lose heritage, you won't get it back.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rwayda Al-Hamad, for a very stimulating and interesting conversation today.
Thank you.
For those of you out there, I hope that you'll join us for our next talk in a few weeks with Dr. Matthias Pantelli. We'll be talking about electricity systems, and then followed the following week by Dr. Zihan Jafar, talking about biodiversity and urban coral reefs in Singapore. Please follow us on Twitter for updates at UMCrisisStudies, and we will be posting replays of this lecture and other lectures on our YouTube site. So thank you very much for tuning in.